Okay, hello and welcome to this lecture on presidents and their foreign policies. I'm Daniel Kirsch, and today there's no way, of course, that I could take you through the entire chapter. There just isn't. It's the longest chapter in the textbook, I believe, or at least close to it. And what it's going to be useful to do instead, I think, is to go through all of the presidents in the 20th century that had a major impact on foreign policy that we still are dealing with the legacies of today. And that's basically all of them. But I've tried to kind of pull out some highlights here. And I'll try not to dwell too long on any one, but I think it's best if I do go through them in a kind of chronological way. And then we can kind of visit any of the themes of the textbook, which are wide and varying, from bureaucratic politics to international obligations to the kind of partisan framework, which is really what we're going to be dealing primarily with, but also the kind of directives of foreign policy and the kind of major themes that we can detect in hindsight throughout foreign policy. So to do that, let's start with that origin of strong, muscular, as they say, Wilsonianism, and that's Wilson himself. In an earlier version of this lecture, I spent way too much time on Wilson, but it's easy to do that. Wilson's a very interesting character, and I think I'll skip some of the personal stuff and just move directly to the kind of crux of why he's an interesting president. And it's basically for his intellectual arrogance. He was a political scientist, oddly enough, one of our own, you might say. And he decided to become a politician. And when he was in office, of course, he promised he wouldn't get into World War I. Then he did, so that the U.S. could win it. Then when he was in it, he decided it was going to be the war to end all wars. That was how he sold it to the American people. He also spent 6 months negotiating the peace treaty, the Versailles Peace Treaty outside of Paris, with the European powers. And he had this whole plan, and I'll just tell you the centerpiece, the League of Nations. He was willing to give just about on every point except the League of Nations. He was able to, but he kind of stretched it so far that the League of Nations was sort of a Pyrrhic victory, a hollow victory. Simply because, of course, France and Britain and the other power, Italy, and the other powers involved agreed to the new League of Nations, and they would all send representatives to the League of Nations. And it's self-explanatory, right? We know what the League of Nations was. It was like a preview of the UN today. It was representatives from all the nations trying to achieve peace through communication and cooperation. Unfortunately, such an organization probably is most effective when you have the primary instigators and players in military conflicts there to negotiate further avoidances of military conflicts. Unfortunately, Germany, as part of the peace that Wilson had to really give in on, so that Germany wasn't allowed to join the League of Nations. Germany, who was bearing official responsibility for World War I at the behest of France and England, was not allowed to join. The U.S. was allowed to join, but Wilson ran into problems at home. Wilson, what he didn't do was count on the fact that there was now a Republican-led Senate, and he was a Democrat. And the Republican-led Senate has been labeled by history as isolationist, though I'm not sure that's fair. People were tired of war. They'd only had about 2 years of it, and they thought they'd have none of it. And the people in the Senate said that, actually, we'll ratify your treaty. We just have to ask you to agree to one condition. And that condition is that it's called a reservation. We will attach to our passage or ratification of this treaty, which the Senate has to do constitutionally in the U.S., that whatever happens in the League of Nations, no U.S. troops will be put under foreign command, and no U.S. interests will be contravened. No U.S. interests will be acted against by the League of Nations, and the U.S. will not commit to the League of Nations if it's found that the U.S. is going to be not served by it. So, as I'm paraphrasing, of course, Wilson was not willing to abide by those conditions, and so he decided to instead of thanking the Senate for a compromise, he decided to oppose them in every way and conducted a whistle-stop train campaign across the country to change the minds of all of the American people who had voted against him in the last midterm election. And he decided to use all of his kind of family's Presbyterian minister background in his oratory to try to change the minds of people. Whether or not he was successful, I don't know. Doesn't seem like he was, but I know that he completely exhausted his body to the point where he had a stroke. And not only did he have a stroke that debilitated him physically, but mentally did not do anything, except maybe made him more tired and maybe depressed, things like that. But his mental faculties were still in existence. He got even more angry and shouted down compromise and became very difficult to see in public and also to communicate with, and so all communication went through his wife. This is where a lot of people say that we had the first woman president was Edith Bowling Galt Wilson, Wilson's second wife, and she was the gatekeeper between the president and the rest of the world, even his doctor. So in modern day, we might see a vice president perhaps taking over, but his vice president was not allowed to do so by him or his partner. So in any event, the U.S. ultimately did not join the League of Nations because the Senate did not ratify the treaty in any way. And so the U.S. and Germany were both, for the next almost 10 years, locked out of the League of Nations. The U.S. never did join, and Germany joined after it fulfilled a lot of conditions, but by then there was so much resentment in Germany that eventually they pulled out of their own free will. They decided they didn't want any part of it anyway. So Wilson was the originator really of a liberal internationalist foreign policy, or at least a vision for one. Despite the fact there was no American participation in the League of Nations, the Americans were the architect of it. And certainly their interests were represented by their allies' interests. And the vision itself of the League of Nations was something that was realized in a very real way for over 10 years, that all the nations of the world were able to see, witness and experience for themselves. And so this robust internationalism that's backed by American military and economic power, that seeks to safeguard, perhaps if not democracy, then at least sort of a desire for peace and cooperation among nations, is what the baseline. That's why those principles are all sort of agreed upon, is more or less, by most internationalists in the U.S. Foreign policy establishment today. So that's why it's called Wilsonianism. And I will just say briefly about FDR that in his attempt to he was part of the Wilson administration. He worked in the Department of the Navy. He was assistant secretary, and he was a big part, I'm sure, of the win in World War I, of assisting through the Navy. And he saw how Wilson misplayed his hand and was then very careful when he finally got back into politics and was president himself, and once again saw the U.S. staring in the face of European conflict. He proceeded very cautiously. He did not just dive right in. He spent about 2 years on something called the Lend-Lease Act, which meant that they provided easy loans and of both money and materials to Great Britain to be able to wage their war in the Second World War, until it became, of course, politically necessary to respond to the attack on Pearl Harbor in World War II. But until then, that's how Roosevelt was planning to engage with World War I, was as an ally of the Allies rather than a participant themselves. And then he further attempted to improve on Wilson's legacy by beginning negotiations about a United Nations, which of course is just a sequel to the League of Nations. And this time there was not going to be blame so much as there was going to be a seeking of inclusion of just about every nation in the world. The Truman administration sought to improve on the Roosevelt administration by continuing the policies of the Roosevelt administration, not only in the United Nations, but also in the kind of general and specific policies of his predecessor. Truman was really thrust into the office, very short-lived vice presidency. After Roosevelt was elected the fourth time, Truman, after a few months, was thrust into the presidency, and he immediately had to deal with the end of World War II on both the European and the Pacific front. On the European front, that was relatively easy. The Soviet Union was, relatively, of course. So it was largely, the tide had turned in both fronts, but the Soviet Union had done a lot to make advances on the Eastern Front towards Germany. And on the Western Front, D-Day had already occurred in June of the previous year, and so there were U.S. forces on the ground in France and Germany. So they were about to meet in the middle in Germany and divide up the country, really, after the end of the war. But one of the primary things that Truman's remembered for, and to his credit, he acknowledged this in the making of his presidential library, which we'll talk more about later on. But at his presidential library, there is a recognition explicitly that he wants visitors and onlookers and citizens, scholars, to be able to study his decision making, and specifically the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan to end World War II, his legacy, he doesn't take a position on it. He never felt good about it, of course. But he also, as I say, to his credit, made it a very clear directive in making his kind of memorial library and museum to make it so that people could go comfortably through his life and his presidency and observe it, and not have it, and not make apologies and not make excuses, but sort of give you all the facts of what he was facing. And I thought it was much more it was at least respectful towards the loss of life in those two cities, and certainly more so than other museums I've been to that talk much more about the atomic age and the hype around it than it does about the actual people who died as a result of the use of those weapons. The only time they've been used in history is by the U.S. against Japan. But another one of his legacies is much more celebrated, certainly, and that's the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was named as such by the press because it was the plan by George Marshall, former Army Chief of Staff, who became the Secretary of State in the Truman administration. And they sought, again, to improve upon Wilson's legacy, which arguably was probably something that Roosevelt was going to be working on, to rebuild Europe, and specifically Germany, through a very comprehensive aid package, building new infrastructure, rebuilding the economy as well, and just basically attempting, instead to punish or to blame, instead to officially try to bring the European powers onto the world stage, re-emerging as a U.S. ally. This was hampered, of course, by the fact that Eastern Germany fell under the military and then the political control of the Soviet Union. And this was it was made clear at the end of the Cold War at the end of the Second World War that the Cold War was beginning. And in the Cold War, the Russians and the Soviets decided that they were going to attempt to make permanent their military control over Eastern Europe that had been merely a territorial advancement during the war. They decided to permanently militarily occupy not only all of the states of the Soviet Union that were not Russian majority, but then also those states that were newly occupied, like Poland, the Czech Republic, back then Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Moldova, all of those, Bulgaria, all of the Eastern European, Yugoslavia countries. And when they did that, they also sought to impose their political and economic model, which was explicitly socialist and driven centrally by Moscow's authority. So they rewrote all of these constitutions. They imposed new governments. They sought, to persecute all people who were not in agreement with the new regime. So they became, in effect, a new series of totalitarian states, all centrally controlled by one in Moscow. And Stalin was so thoroughly in charge of this that he attempted to block off Western food delivery to the city of Berlin that was still under Western control. So even though within all of the new kind of territory of Eastern Germany, there was also the city of Berlin entirely in it, they had an agreement after World War II to allow traffic to go between roads between Berlin and Western Germany. But there was no city of West Berlin per se. It was just sort of the Western occupied portion of the city, and they cut off the roads, and so the Allies began something called the Berlin Airlift. And I actually had a great uncle who I never knew, but one of my grandparents' brother was a pilot in the Berlin Airlift, and so it was kind of this. He's kind of an eyewitness to the beginning of the Cold War, so that was kind of interesting. He later became a poet. Anyway, taught poetry at a community college. Anyway, that's okay. I'll stop talking about that. But then, what they quickly realized in the next 2 years during the Truman administration was the need for a policy called containment. And containment was simply the policy of making sure that you checked Soviet power anywhere it went. And the reason to do that was because the Soviet Union felt that, and perhaps rightly so, that any identification with, in the future, an explicitly socialist or communist, and that is kind of class-based, usually military allied political regime that sought to impose either workers' councils or basically a Marx-flavored kind of labor-focused government on a people, or one run explicitly for the benefit of either the peasant class or the industrial workers class, that further sought to usually repress other freedoms, and through the use of force, was to be celebrated and allied with, because anytime socialists or communists were mentioned in the U.S., that became quickly associated with the Soviet Union and the Russian language, the Russian culture, and people. And so the Russians thought maybe we could use this to our advantage, and we could actually establish allies among people who leaned this way politically. And so they would offer aid packages and military assistance and military alliance with these countries that may have had nothing to do with them, countries like Cuba and Vietnam. And Cuba just happened to be off the coast of the U.S., and they had just engaged in a revolution where they threw out a bunch of American property owners and casino owners and things like that, and tourism focused economy that was largely American owned. They threw it away violently in the Cuban Revolution, and they initially said they were hostile to the Soviet Union, but they changed their minds. And the Soviet Union then, as a condition of their allyship, decided to ask them to have some missiles, some atomic missiles stored at the on Cuban soil, and this precipitated the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm sorry, I sort of skipped over containment. So containment. Yes, they were right. So the U.S. came out with a policy that was drafted by initially anonymously by a scholar who worked for the Truman administration called George Kennan, that the U.S. needs to stop the spread of socialism, communism, Russian influence, or Soviet economic or political association to virtually every government in every country in the world, including the U.S. And so they needed to sort of be explicitly anti-communist and anti-socialist in order to do that. And so the Truman administration basically signed on to this, and this became the policy. This became the U.S. foreign policy for the next 45 years. And so part of that was early on in that, only a decade afterwards, the Kennedy administration is seeking to demonstrate that it's not going to be pushed around by this new Fidel Castro-led regime in Cuba, who had tossed the Americans out in an internal revolution. And so when it became clear that the Soviet Union had placed intercontinental ballistic missiles on Cuban soil, that they were going to have to confront both Cuba and the Soviet Union to try to get them away. And the Kennedy administration, I really recommend the movie 13 Days to see all of this, by the way. It's pretty good. But you talk about cabinet dynamics. You see all of the discussions between how much the military basically distrusted the Kennedy administration and how much the Kennedy administration didn't want to get embroiled in World War III, which was so soon after World War II, only about 18 years, not even 18 years after World War II. So eventually the U.S. privately offered the Soviet Union a deal where they would take their missiles away from Turkey, and the Soviet Union would take their missiles away from Cuba, and they kind of averted then all-out war, and it would have been an unprecedented loss of life, no question about it, if the U.S. and the Soviet Union had actually gone to war. And they were very literally, geographically, very close, and there were some nuclear submarines and battleships that were positioned in a way in the Atlantic Ocean that no one should ever feel comfortable with. Okay, but soon after the Kennedy administration, immediately after the Kennedy administration, was the Johnson administration. We'll talk about that next. The Johnson administration is rightly remembered for really two sets of priorities. One is the expansion of the social welfare state, the war on poverty in the Great Society, and the other is the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War really began in earnest in 1964 after the apparent attack on the American ships in the Tonkin Gulf, and Congress responded that the U.S. should retaliate against North Vietnam for those attacks. But what were those ships doing there in the first place? Well, they had military advisors, which were just, a small amount of troops, and they were continuing the French colonial legacy in what was then called Indochina by the French. And the U.S. inherited this really as a direct result of its victory in World War II, and seeking to utilize and expropriate the resources of the Republic of Vietnam and or the country of Vietnam, and in addition to kind of have a military presence along the Southeast Asia trade route. So Vietnam strategically was important, and also it was this place where in North Vietnam, because Ho Chi Minh had grown up during this French colonial period, he started reading a lot of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, and he ended up as this kind of peasant hero, as someone who was spreading this idea of establishing an independent Vietnamese political force that was explicitly run for the peasants. And so he was this kind of really robust nationalist and communist figure that was extremely popular with all the people, but obviously for his drive to independence alone made him unpopular among the Americans, as well as the fact that he was allied with the Soviet Union ideologically. That doesn't mean he was allied with them at first militarily or politically, but eventually it came to that when the U.S. tried to set up its own regime in South Vietnam that had a lot of problems. And this was, I also skipped over the Korean War, but like the Korean War, the Vietnam War would become a proxy war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, between the South Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese. And in coincidence, the South Koreans were kind of were a friendly regime, to say the least, with the U.S., and North Korea was virtually controlled by, at first, the Soviet Union. So part of the policy of containment was making sure that the idea of communism, especially, and Soviet-style communism specifically, didn't spread throughout the country, and more than the idea, the political control. So hundreds of thousands of troops were committed by Lyndon Johnson to try to establish control over Vietnam during the Vietnamese War. And well over 1 million people died. 58,000 American troops died alongside all of those Vietnamese civilians and Vietnamese troops on both the South and North Vietnamese side. And it lasted about 10 years and virtually defined a generation. This was a period when the baby boomers particularly were of draft age, and it's probably because of this war that we don't have a draft anymore, because there were 2 things that made this war very unpopular. 3 things that made this war very unpopular. 1, the U.S. was losing and did essentially lose the Vietnam War. 2, there was a nightly body count on the nightly news that everyone watched in the U.S. So that was sobering every day. And this is, again, for like a decade, but it started really in 1968 to be this unpopular. And the last part was the draft. And because they knew the U.S. was losing and there was this body count, and if you were compelled to, you could go and serve in the military even if you were completely against the war. If you were a conscientious objector, I believe you might be able to get away and sort of officially declare yourself against the war for religious reasons, usually, Quakers particularly. But if you were just someone who didn't know much about war but didn't want to go, you had to go. And so 58,000 young men died. I'm not sure there were women in combat at that point. So Nixon ran on a platform in 1968, even though Robert F. Kennedy died during the presidential campaign. He was assassinated during the presidential campaign right after his victory in California, planning to run against the war. And he was running against the war, and so was Eugene McCarthy. But neither one of them obtained victory in 1968. Richard Nixon did. He said, despite the fact that he was on sort of the conservative side of things, he had a secret plan to end the war. He was on the anti-communist side. He was very credible as an anti-communist, to say the least, and so he ran on this secret plan to end the war, and he won, but then he did not end the war when he got there. He said he sought the Vietnamization of the war, and he really was a fan of Benjamin Disraeli in history, and even in British, he was a British prime minister who had this phrase, peace with honor. But then so did Neville Chamberlain, who was the appeaser at Munich. But those are references you might not know. But suffice to say, he had a strange kind of historical reading. And he wanted to leave the Vietnam War without having to win it. He wanted it both ways. And so when he sought to begin peace negotiations with Vietnam early in his presidency, he also decided to extend the war to another neighboring nation of Cambodia. When he bombed Cambodia, he essentially declared war on another nation state without the permission of Congress. And that was one of the things there were articles of impeachment drawn up against him for. And that may have been one of the more obvious ones besides Watergate. So besides Cambodia, Nixon's whole theme of his presidency was throwing people off balance, and he sought to throw the Vietnamese off balance by bombing Cambodia. He sought to throw voters off balance by saying, wait, this pro-defense person is campaigning as an anti-war dove. It's how intriguing. He sought to throw off the Soviet Union by allying himself with China, by recognizing China diplomatically, China that had been not recognized as the legitimate government of China for 20 years after their 1949 Communist Revolution. But after they had fallen out with the Soviet Union in 1964, he thought they were an independent actor that needed to be recognized. And Mao Zedong was a powerful leader that could make a decision very personally to engage with the U.S. or not. And so he did. He opened China to the U.S. in the early 1970s, and as largely a gesture to scare the Soviet Union into a series of nuclear peace treaty negotiations. And détente, which is a French word for just peaceful coexistence. And if any of you know French and I'm getting that wrong, I apologize. I'm just telling you what the understanding in history and in journalism has been, that détente was essentially it was a French word, and it was meant in the modern context for peaceful coexistence between the two great powers. And so that was the legacy of Nixon, and he eventually had to resign in disgrace, but he did succeed in opening up China and in the diplomacy between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And he did also succeed in the Vietnamization of the war, or at least in getting American troops out. By the time they did, of course, his successor, Ford, was in office. So maybe about a year or so after Nixon left. But it was a very unpopular war, and he was probably right to be on the side of it that he was. Carter, once he was in office, made it a point to say that U.S. foreign policy needed to be based explicitly on recognizing human rights. And that was complicated for a couple of reasons. Carter was someone who didn't have a lot of credibility internationally, or at least he was trying to heal the wounds still of the Vietnam War, just a couple of years after the fact, and he did pardon all the draft evaders in the Vietnam War. But one thing that he was not really forgiven for by the public was this hostage situation in Iran, and Iran has an interesting history with the U.S. because one thing that most Americans know is that there's a revolution in 1979. The Islamic fundamentalists overthrew the Shah. The Shah was this kind of royal family that had been in power since, I think, 1953 is the precise year. But they had been in power because the U.S. put them there. And the reason the U.S. put them there is because the British, specifically, had owned a series of oil fields in Iran. And Mohammad Mossadegh, a strong kind of national leader of the Republic of Iran in 1951, decided to nationalize the oil fields, meaning take them away, declare foreign ownership null and void, and not honor their property rights to those oil fields within their republic. And this is a theme around the world. When countries try to nationalize something, it usually means that they are trying to take away the foreign ownership of those things. And that was true in Guatemala when the Chiquita Banana Company, the United Fruit Company, owned more than 70% of the land in Guatemala. That was true in Chile in 1973 when the U.S. and the CIA, under the behest of Nixon, had assassinated the freely elected socialist prime minister of Chile, president of Chile, Salvador Allende, simply because part of his program was to nationalize the power lines that were owned by an American company. So all of this to say that there are always more reasons than just the ones on the surface for why U.S. foreign policy is conducted the way that it is. And certainly much more than human rights. But Reagan sought to kind of improve on this and give a kind of more ideological face to the reasons for American foreign policy. And one of them was certainly in Nicaragua. He helped fund at least a military operation to overthrow a left-wing, socialist-oriented Nicaraguan dictator, and named Manuel Noriega, by funding the Contras, the word meaning against, the people that were against the regime, the anti-socialist regime. And he did this by selling arms to Iran. And the reason they decided not to sell arms to Iran was because they were supposed to be against Iran. Iran was still called the U.S. the Great Satan. They were in a war against a U.S. ally called Iraq in the early 1980s for 8 years. And Iran was opposed to the U.S., but they weren't opposed to weapons, and they needed weapons, so they paid for them, and they funded the Contras. So the problem is that this Iran-Contra thing was illegal. You're not supposed to just fund a war through arms sales to another country, and Reagan denied knowing anything about it, and so he was either lying, and he did, or if he didn't know this extremely intricate and labor-intensive multi-billion-dollar scheme did not escaped his radar, then that's problematic too. It means he didn't really know what was going on day to day in his own White House. So that was one kind of scandal that almost brought down. Really, it was people thought it was at the level of Watergate at the time. But they considered Reagan to be, that was the end of his credible presidency. But he did much more than just this one kind of scandal that was between the Middle East and, getting back to Iran, what we got onto first with Iran was most people know that there was a revolution there in 1979. For a long time, there was a hostage situation of Iranians who took Americans hostage at the embassy. But in addition to that, the Reagan administration, the day that the Reagan administration took office, the hostages were released for some reason. And maybe a gesture of goodwill, I don't know. But it was over, and the Carter administration had to weather, the bad press from having these Americans held hostage for over a year. So the Reagan administration, still called the new Khomeini regime, a very hostile regime and an unlawful one. And it was eventually called by George W. Bush part of the axis of evil. So, but that's the reason that the Iranians, at least the Iranian regime in power still today, doesn't like the U.S. is because the U.S. Imposed on them basically a foreign-friendly government for over 25 years in order to rob them of their, what they see as their rightful natural resources, their oil. So, during the Reagan administration, though, one of Reagan's other priorities was, of course, to deal with the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War. And by this time, they were supposed to be living in détente with the Soviet Union in peaceful coexistence. But Reagan was an anti-communist from back when he named names during the Red Scare. So he was the president of the Actors Union, the Screen Actors Guild, and then he became an outspoken Republican who made speeches on behalf of General Electric and the American Medical Association against Medicare, against the adoption of what he called socialized medicine through speeches he was paid to give. And then he ran for governor of California and imposed a lot of budget cuts and tuition increases on University of California and the California State University system. So Reagan was someone who had a lot of credibility as an anti-communist, and rather than, as Nixon did, kind of go against that and seek to open up trade or commerce or something with the Soviet Union, he decided to intimidate them further. And one of the things he did was by standing in Berlin and saying to the Soviet leader, tear down this wall, the Berlin Wall. And, that dare was to keep people in Berlin. And that dare was sort of heard around the world, and in addition to that, he built up this anti-nuclear weapons system that was supposed to shoot nuclear weapons out of the sky from space. And sounds kind of like a great idea, but it also has never worked to my knowledge, and I could be wrong about that. And if you bring me a news article or a verified report that it has been tested to be accurate, then I retract my comments, but or at least that comment. But so far, there's been billions of dollars spent on this system called the Strategic Defense Initiative. Its detractors called it Star Wars in the 1980s. But it cost a lot of money. And this big defense buildup that Reagan was part of, or that he led, was meant to intimidate the Soviet Union. And it was effective because it worked, because the Soviet Union was not very powerful economically. They were spending kind of all their money on defense. And if you were spending all your money on defense, guess what you're not doing? Is bolstering your infrastructure or your social welfare programs or just anything other than defense. And so the Soviet Union kind of crumbled under the weight of their numbers, because they were about a third as rich as the U.S., with about the same number of people. And they had the same level of defense spending. So that's incredible, right? So just to have sacrificed so much and then to have so little to show for it, that in the end, the Soviet Union became very unpopular among its people because they were unable to get any money to help them during a recession. So it just crumbled. So it just dissolved. So the military stopped sending troops and funding troops in all of those foreign countries, and as well as the rest of the Soviet Union. They had to dissolve the entity known as the Soviet. It'd be like dissolving the United States. You're left with what? California, New York, Texas, Ohio, and that's what happened in the Soviet Union. They had 15 states of all different nationalities, and they just dissolved the Soviet Union, and now that's why we have Russia now. And so, that's kind of, but Russia inherited the entire nuclear arsenal of the Soviet Union, as many nuclear weapons as the Soviet Union had, and as the U.S. has. But one of the things that Reagan tried to do to abolish nuclear weapons was he did hold a series of peace conferences, and he did end up signing some peace treaties to limit the spread of nuclear weapons with the Soviet Union. One of them was in Iceland at Reykjavik, and there was this negotiation where they said, well, what if we abolished all the nuclear weapons? And Gorbachev's only condition was that, okay, for me to sell this to my people, you need to also get rid of that space-based missile defense system. And Reagan wouldn't do that. So they were at an impasse, so they stopped. And so they left, and that was it. So, they had a chance, and it seemed like, and it's a great video. It's really well documented. Maybe I'll share it with you on Canvas. But Reagan was unable to rekindle that interest. So let me move on to one of the other pieces of leadership you saw in the Bush administration in terms of his war with Iraq. But actually, let me do that in the next segment. So the George H.W. Bush administration inherited this world that was newly freed of the Cold War in 1989, and he sort of his administration witnessed really the end of the Cold War. That was precipitated by this recession that was partially certainly aided by this military buildup that Reagan had begun. But Bush, as a leader, he was able to, as a diplomat, assemble a coalition of people, but also as a military leader, he was able to demonstrate that you could assemble a coalition for limited circumstances to win wars in a way that hadn't been done on a large scale since Vietnam. And when the U.S. engaged in this Persian Gulf War with, I think, 19 members in its coalition to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, which he had invaded for its oil fields, it was seen as a victory on the diplomatic stage and certainly the military stage. But what's not often mentioned is something that is mentioned in your book, is that immediately when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, Bush did something that many presidents have done, is they just moved troops to force the issue. They moved troops first, and he moved 200,000 troops to Saudi Arabia, and those Saudi Arabian troops were there to guard the U.S.-owned oil fields in Saudi Arabia, and so that was kind of what precipitated at least the ability to go and fight a largely air-based war with Iraq. And after the end, they decided not to go into Baghdad and try to make this an additional war, but they decided they could live with Saddam Hussein if they could just get him out of a foreign country, Kuwait, that was an extensive American ally. But also during the Bush administration, he negotiated and Clinton signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was this brand new trade agreement that helped promote the end of taxes on labor and environmental protections between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. And this didn't come from all of this, but this combined with the Clinton administration's embrace of permanent normal trade relations with China, which today is the leading manufacturer in the world by far, it allowed, those two things contributed to a 33% drop between 2000 and 2010 of U.S. manufacturing jobs. So I wouldn't call it entirely a negative legacy. You can characterize it however you like, but it definitely changed the U.S. economy and it doesn't seem like it changed it for the better. And certainly politically, we have yet to fully realize the ramifications, or perhaps we have realized the ramifications of the public dissatisfaction with those trade deals. I think we probably saw it in 2016. But in the Clinton administration, he largely continued the Bush legacy of attempting to define a new course for American foreign policy that was focused on U.S. national interests, but also with this kind of tinge of respecting human rights as well. But definitely with the Clinton administration, I think it's fair to say, hewed much more closely to the Bush line than the Carter line. All of the conflicts that I'm listing here, Iraq, they continued a no-fly zone in the south and north of Iraq that they enforced by regular bombings. Yugoslavia, there was a genocide in Yugoslavia, and it was only after the genocide that, and a series of genocides, that genocidal events, that the U.S. decided to intervene in any way in 1999. Let's see, they intervened in Haiti by attempting to install and rescue a U.S.-backed and economically allied regime. And they bombed, I believe, either a pharmaceutical plant or a hospital in South Sudan in an effort to stabilize the region there. So there was a lot of military intervention during and Rwanda, who can forget Rwanda, where the U.S. essentially, despite credible, regular reports from the New York Times that there was an ongoing genocide in Rwanda, the U.S. and the Clinton administration and the Secretary of State and all of the other defense establishment elected not to intervene and waited out for a while. And they essentially allowed, in April 1994, for, I don't remember the number, and I don't want to be disrespectful, but an enormously tragic number of people were slaughtered in Rwanda in that year. And the Clinton administration did really nothing until it was too late. So that was the Clinton administration, and it was in this environment where there was a series of kind of failures to intervene in a human rights perspective, and certainly a not a failure, but a willingness to continue the largely Republican-led foreign policy of national interests, expansion, and energy policing around the world, that it was in this environment of kind of uncertainty about a new direction that George W. Bush took office in 2001. When George W. Bush took office as president in 2001, and he had taken office as, a president that did not win the popular vote, he was very narrowly elected, and perhaps, I think it's fair to say there was at least a disputed election result in Florida, but ultimately he was seen by the public as a legitimate president, so he began his administration. He struggled to gain his footing and establish priorities. He was able to pass a tax cut in, I think, May of 2001. But other than that, he didn't have a whole lot of victories. I think that and No Child Left Behind, a national testing regime, were his signature accomplishments. Oh, and a faith-based initiative that allowed for federal funds to go to religious organizations for charitable work. It was in this environment that on September 11, 2001, 19 Al-Qaeda members, terrorist members of the Al-Qaeda organization, hijacked a series of planes that crashed into the two World Trade Centers buildings in New York City, into the Pentagon in Virginia, and would have, were it not for the intervention of passengers, civilian passengers. They crashed in Pennsylvania. The third one was headed for somewhere else in Washington, D.C., either the White House or the Capitol. And so thousands of people died. Over 3,000 people died directly on that day, and as a direct result, George W. Bush's popularity was definitely the result of a kind of patriotic sentiment in the country to a response to this massive terrorist plot, and so the public was behind him with as high of an approval rating as his father had, about 90%, right after the Iraq War. So he felt that it was appropriate to go ahead with his commander's military recommendations, which were to, at least at first, strategically bomb the training camps of the Saudi Arabian-based Al-Qaeda in the Taliban-held fundamentalist regime of Afghanistan in Central Asia. So they bombed Afghanistan, and then they attempted to expand that mandate to take over the country of Afghanistan by overthrowing the regime that was friendly to Al-Qaeda, the Taliban. And they allied with all of these Northern Alliance tribes that had been actually fighting alongside. These Northern Alliance